George Orwell's 1984 is often cited as a novel which describes a dystopia with an all-powerful government. It is really often used as an argument against government intervention, but that's a very adolescent understanding of what the novel is actually saying. Orwell grew up in England and was caught up in a desire for adventure which led him to volunteer for the Spanish Civil War on the side of the anarcho-communists. Afterwards, he was forced to write propaganda for the British Empire during World War II. During the Cold War, he was an anti-Soviet socialist living in a capitalist nation. It is in this politically tumultuous time when he wrote the novel, 1984. At its core, it's a story about how society can shape the minds of those within it. Winston is no hero. He's just an average guy. He's a cog in the machine, a replaceable part that is only significant because of his insignificance. He's far from the character who's most radical, the most capable of taking on Big Brother or overthrowing the party. His resistance comes in melancholic defiance, not for the sake of something greater, but because Winston really just wants to get his fucking rocks off. He lives in a world of cogs, and he is simply one of them. In the novel, Orwell didn't describe a generalized anger towards the government of the party. Instead, Orwell creates a critique describing an anger not towards the ruling party of Oceania, but towards the ruling party of other nations. The most savage yells of all came from the school children. The speech had been proceeding for perhaps 20 minutes when a messenger hurried onto the platform, and a scrap of paper was slipped into the speaker's hands. He unrolled it and read it. Without pausing in his speech, nothing altered in his voice or manner, or in the content of what he was saying, but suddenly the names were different. Without words said, a wave of understanding rippled through the crowd. Oceania was at war with East Asia. The next moment, there was tremendous commotion. The banners and posters with which the square was decorated were all wrong. 1 minute more, and the feral roars of rage were again bursting from the crowd. The hate continued exactly as before, except the target had changed. Orwell shows if the cogs are focused on hating an other, whoever the other may be, they will never look up and see who the enemy truly is. Beep bop. Over the last couple of years, I've been following American politics with a cynical eye, and something interesting has stood out to me. Both parties pretty much stand for the exact same thing. But wait, you say, how can they stand for the same thing? They're constantly arguing, canceling, and fighting one another. Well, let me provide some context in what I mean. Republicans and Democrats both fall under the label of neoliberal in terms of economic policy. Now, why am I only going to focus on economic policy in the scope of this video? The answer to that question is another question. What policy affects everyday Americans the most? The answer is economic policy. Foreign policy may once have been the answer, but in today's world, America cannot be challenged in any significant way on the world stage. Perhaps the culture war then. Perhaps the culture war is what affects people the most. Well, perhaps the culture war is what affects people. Well, perhaps it's the culture war that affects people the most. While true, the culture war takes up most of the time on mainstream news, your cousin's Instagram story, and your grandfather's Facebook page, it doesn't affect Americans as much as it has been made out to seem so. Critical race theory, a frontline issue for parents voting in the Virginia governor's race, is a complex legal term that has been co-opted by the right-wing media apparatus to scare parents. It wasn't being taught in schools and still isn't being taught in schools. On the flip side of the culture war, let's look at trans rights. Trans people have higher suicide rates and rates of being sexually abused than cisgendered people. It is definitely important to normalize trans people to lower these numbers, but it doesn't tell the full story. Democrats are content with giving a black trans woman the right to transition and change her registration on her driver's license. Republicans prefer not to do this and misgender the person. But in the end, neither party cares if that woman ends up homeless, jobless, or dead because of economic issues. That's the free market, baby. The poor get what the poor deserve. black, white, trans, cis, adult, or minor. Economic policy is the only policy that could truly give some equality to the working class in America, regardless of where we stand on the culture war. Before I go any further, I would like to clarify something. Most of my critique towards inaction is going to be dedicated towards the Democratic Party. This is for the simple fact that Republicans label themselves as conservatives, and so naturally they don't stand for advancing anything into the future. Their drive is to conserve. Inaction is the name of their game. I don't want to get too deep into economic theory, but both parties basically believe the government does some good being involved in the economy. It just shouldn't be too invasive. This is the idea pioneered by Ronald Reagan after a long period of what's called classical liberalism, where the government was heavily involved in the economic policy which was pioneered by FDR. Point is, today both parties subscribe to the same economic policy, which has been proven over and over not to work and heavily favors the rich and harms the poor. The main tenet of conservatism, as previously stated, is the fact that everything used to be better in the past, and we should conserve things the way they are or used to be. In practice, this looks like giving tax cuts to everyone, but suspiciously tax cuts disproportionately to help the rich. Current Democratic doctrine is that the government should be a little more involved than conservatives want. In practice, this looks like saying the conservative policy is bad, but in the end, not changing anything when Democrats are in power. To show you what I mean, I'll give you a couple examples. To start off, let's oil our bodies into the sweet scent of present-day tax code. Okay, so since Reagan, there has been a steady decrease in the amount of taxes paid by corporations and the general public. The way this has been accomplished is through the simple fact that the two-party system doesn't provide any real countermeasures when both parties look to benefit the rich. To show you what this looks like in practice, let's look at the last 5 years of the US tax code. With Obama, the corporate tax rate was 35%, and the tax rate by group looked like this. The blue bars show what it was under Obama, and the red bars show what it currently is under Trump's tax law. As you can see, Trump cut taxes across the board, but really Obama's taxes were far from progressive. My grandpa always told me that when you listen to candidates talk about their policy, you can usually do some math in your head to see if their math checks out. So, let's do some math. Both the Obama and Trump tax rates tax the bottom 20% at 20%, which make an average around $14,000 a year, meaning they would end each year with about $11,000 in cash. I honestly do not understand how any American is expected to survive with even twice that amount. In contrast, the top earners under both brackets will get taxed around 35%. The average of their income is $2 million, so the average of the top earners would end each month with around $11,000. Now, there could be arguments for why this is good or bad. This is really bad. Anyone who thinks that's good is either a demon or a bootlicker. But the point I'm making is that either tax code, in the end, the result is the same. Both Democrats and Republicans want to tax around where it is right now, and neither is going to dramatically change it. So how have both parties gotten away with this while acting like they're at war with each other? Well, you can see the answer by looking at any mainstream news organization. The ones more liberal shower Biden as some sort of savior, and the ones more right call him a communist. In reality, he hasn't even proposed a concrete tax plan to replace Trump's, and he plans to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, in between what it was under Trump and Obama. I'm a firm believer in correlation does not imply causation, so I don't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe the Democrats have just been more busy with other things like minimum wage, infrastructure, and healthcare. They've actually made a lot of progress in these fields, except for one thing. They haven't. 10 Democratic senators voted down a raise to the minimum wage. I'm sure that's because they get paid around $7.25 an hour, and they can live comfortably with that. Wait. Okay, but healthcare though. The Democratic platform clearly says securing universal healthcare through a public option. Democrats believe we need to protect, strengthen, and build upon our bedrock healthcare programs, the Affordable Care Act, Medicare. To achieve this objective, we will give all Americans the choice to select high-quality, affordable public option through the Affordable Care Act marketplace. That sounds at least kind of progressive. I mean, other developed countries in the world just provide free healthcare, but I guess it's better than what we have now. I'm glad they've definitely put this to a vote and passed it to immediate. What? Um, what do you mean they haven't done that? They're not even gonna vote on healthcare at all? They don't have any plans to? Okay. Okay. So let's look at one last piece of economic policy. Infrastructure. Both parties have been hitting on the fact that we desperately need infrastructure. In 2020, Trump announced a plan that would cost around $1 trillion and provide infrastructure to roads, bridges, and have an emphasis on putting up 5G towers for faster internet. Biden's bill costs a little over $1.2 trillion and will provide infrastructure for roads, bridges, and an emphasis on high-speed internet infrastructure. So, a quick side note, while I was researching this, I thought this was kind of hilarious. The source I found said that Democrats had hoped to finance the infrastructure bill by raising corporate taxes, but that plan was rejected by Republicans. The bipartisan team instead compromised on diverting unused COVID relief funds. So, so what they're doing is instead of making the rich people pay for infrastructure, instead they're taking the money from funds that are dedicated to helping the sick and dying. Okay, anyway, in tax code, healthcare, and minimum wage, the consensus from both parties seems to be to conserve the status quo. In terms of infrastructure, they seem almost identical in their purpose and price. About a month before I had planned on releasing this video, the New York Times posted a video by talented journalist Johnny Harris called "Liberal Hypocrisy is Fueling American Inequality." And I thought, fuck, a much more skilled speaker, editor, and researcher has done my video before I even had a chance. Rather than comparing the two nationally, he looked at a couple localized examples of liberal hypocrisy: housing in California, taxes in Washington, and education in Chicago. It's a really great video and I recommend you check it out. Something I found interesting was his call to action. After explaining in detail how liberal hypocrisy isn't in line with liberal values, he says,
but for some of these foundational democratic values of housing equality, progressive taxation, and education equality, Democrats don't actually embody their values very well.
Then his special guest, Benjamin Applebaum, Mr. Applebaum, comes in with the call to action.
We are not living our values. People who live in blue states, people who profess liberal values, you need to look in the mirror and need to understand that they are not taking the actions that are consistent with those values.
This was weird for me. They describe a systematic problem with contemporary liberalism, and their solution is to look in the mirror? Maybe if it is such a systematic problem, we should acknowledge that some of the foundational issues of neoliberalism are contradictory. What Applebaum is describing are self-proclaimed liberals who want to conserve the status quo of their life. We have a word where I come from, describing people who want to conserve the status quo or want to conserve something from the past. We call them fucking assholes. Maybe have a set of values you can live. And as an affluent liberal who professes BLM and LGBTQ rights, you shouldn't support policies that deny them healthcare and leave them homeless. We have two parties in this country, both attempting to conserve the status quo and using a tactic described by Orwell, where they yell at each other so the masses don't realize they're the exact same fucking thing. America has lost thousands of men and women in pointless wars in my lifetime. We're killing our planet. Inequality is rising. We have to sell our souls to afford healthcare and education. Why the fuck would I want to conserve any part of this broken system?